The wagon wheels creaked against the frozen earth as Margaret pressed her face to the splintered wood, watching the only home she'd ever known disappear behind the bare winter trees. Her father hadn't looked at her when he'd counted the coins. $40, the price they'd settled on for their unmarriageable daughter. Her mother had cried, but not enough to stop it. Too plain for any decent man to want, her father had said that morning, the words casual as discussing the weather. At least this way you'll earn your keep. Margaret was 23, which meant she was ancient by the standards of their small Missouri town. Her sisters had married at 16 and 17, both to farmers' sons with land and prospects. But Margaret had been born with a face that prompted polite silences rather than compliments, features too strong, skin weathered from helping in the fields, hair that hung straight and brown without a hint of curl. In a family of delicate beauties, she was the practical one, the capable one, the invisible one. The rancher who'd purchased her contract sat up front with the driver, his broad back blocking most of her view. His name was James Thornton, and he'd come to town looking for workers for his cattle operation in the Montana Territory. Her father had approached him at the general store, suggested his daughter could cook and clean and work hard. The negotiation had lasted less than 10 minutes. 3 days on the road gave Margaret plenty of time to imagine what awaited her. She'd heard stories about western ranches, brutal work, isolation, men who treated their help like livestock. But what choice did she have? Her family had made it clear there was no place for her anymore. The $40 would help pay for seed come spring. She was simply another resource to be traded away. When they finally arrived at the Thornton Ranch, Margaret's first thought was that it looked lonely. The house was well built, larger than she'd expected, with glass windows that caught the afternoon sun. But it sat in a vast emptiness of rolling grassland, with mountains purple in the distance and not another human dwelling in sight. The isolation made her chest tight. James Thornton helped her down from the wagon with surprising gentleness, his hand steady under her elbow. He was older than she'd realized, perhaps 40, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years squinting into sun and wind. His face was weathered and serious, his hands scarred and calloused. "I'll show you your room first," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "You'll need to rest before supper." The room was small but clean, with a real bed and a window overlooking the eastern pastures. Margaret set down her single bag, everything she owned fit inside it, and waited for him to tell her the rules, to outline her duties, to explain exactly what he expected from a woman he'd paid $40 to acquire. Instead, he lingered in the doorway, hat in his hands. "I know what your father told you about why you're here," he said finally. "I want you to know that's not. I'm not looking for a servant." Margaret stared at him, confused. "Then why did you pay for me?" Something flickered across his face. Pain, perhaps, or memory. "Come down when you're settled. I'll explain over coffee." An hour later, sitting at a kitchen table made of solid oak, James Thornton told her his story. He'd been married once, 12 years ago, to a woman named Catherine. She'd been beautiful, everyone said so. Delicate features, golden hair, the kind of face men wrote poetry about. She'd also been cruel in small, cutting ways that left no visible scars. She'd mocked his hands for being rough, his manner for being too quiet, his dreams for being too simple. When she'd run off with a silver-tongued merchant headed to San Francisco, she'd left a note saying she couldn't bear another day trapped with such a dull, graceless man. "I told myself I'd never marry again," James said, staring into his coffee. "But this ranch is no place for a man alone. Winter especially gets harsh. I needed someone here, but I couldn't stomach the thought of courting, of trying to impress someone, of wondering if they secretly found me lacking." "So you bought someone instead," Margaret said flatly. "Someone who has no choice but to stay." He looked up at her then, and she was startled by the directness of his gaze. "I bought someone your father would have sold to anyone. I'm offering you a partnership, not servitude. This ranch needs work, more than I can handle alone. In return, you'll have a home, security, and respect. If after a year you want to leave, I'll pay for your passage anywhere you want to go and give you $200 besides." Margaret wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but something in his expression stopped her. He meant every word. "And if I want to stay? Then we'll figure it out together. The first weeks were harder than Margaret had imagined. The work was relentless. Cooking, cleaning, helping with the cattle when hands were short, mending fences, preserving food. But James worked twice as hard as anyone, rising before dawn and collapsing into bed long after dark. He never raised his voice, never made demands he wouldn't fulfill himself, never made her feel like property. Slowly, she began to understand what he'd seen in her that day at the general store. Not plainness, but strength. Not unattractiveness, but capability. He'd watched her hands, scarred from farm work like his own, and recognized someone who understood what labor meant. He'd looked past the face her family had declared too plain and seen someone who could survive this harsh, beautiful country. Spring came with brutal storms that tested every fence and shelter on the property. During one terrible night when lightning struck the barn and set it ablaze, Margaret worked alongside James and his 3 hired hands to save the horses. Her hair came loose from its braid and her face was streaked with soot, but she never stopped moving, never hesitated. When dawn finally broke and they stood surveying the damage, James looked at her with something new in his eyes. Not gratitude, exactly, but recognition. "You're stronger than anyone I've ever known," he said. Margaret, exhausted and filthy, felt something crack open in her chest. "I'm still plain, though. That hasn't changed." James was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and gently brushed a streak of ash from her cheek. "Catherine was beautiful," he said. "Looking at her was like looking at a painting. Pleasant enough, but you always knew you were only seeing the surface. Every time I look at you, I see something more. The way you bite your lip when you're concentrating. How your eyes light up when you're pleased with your work. The strength in your shoulders. The kindness in your hands when you tend the animals. If that's plain, then I hope I never see beautiful again." She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he was just being kind, but the words wouldn't come. Because in his eyes, she could see the truth of what he was saying. He wasn't trying to flatter her. He genuinely saw her differently than anyone ever had. Summer brought a different challenge. James's brother arrived from Denver with his wife, a woman named Louisa who had the kind of delicate beauty Margaret's family had valued. Over dinner, Louisa made small, cutting remarks about Margaret's rough hands, her unfashionable dress, her sun-darkened skin. Each comment was delivered with a smile, making it impossible to object without seeming oversensitive. Margaret endured it silently, the old familiar shame settling back over her shoulders like a heavy cloak. But James didn't miss a word. When Louisa compared Margaret's appearance unfavorably to a portrait of Catherine that still hung in the hallway, James stood abruptly. "That portrait's been meaning to come down," he said. He walked to the hallway, lifted the painting from the wall, and carried it out to the barn. When he returned, he looked directly at his sister-in-law. "Margaret is a partner in this ranch and the finest person I've ever known. If you can't treat her with the respect she deserves, you're welcome to leave in the morning." The silence that followed was electric. Louisa's eyes widened in shock. No one had apparently ever spoken to her that way. But it was the expression on James's brother's face that Margaret would remember. A kind of sad understanding, as if he wished he'd had the courage to defend something precious in his own life. That night, after the guests had retired, Margaret found James sitting on the porch watching the stars. She sat beside him without speaking for a long time. "You didn't have to do that," she finally said. "Yes, I did." He turned to look at her, and in the moonlight his weathered face held a tenderness that made her breath catch. "I spent 12 years believing I wasn't enough. That I was too plain, too simple, too dull for anyone to truly value. I won't let you believe those lies about yourself, James." She didn't know how to finish the sentence. How to explain that his words were rewriting something fundamental inside her, replacing her family's dismissal with a different truth entirely. He reached out and took her hand, his scarred palm warm against hers. "I know what your father said when he sold you to me, that you were too plain for any man to want. But he was wrong, Margaret. He was looking at you and seeing what you weren't. I look at you and see everything you are. And that face, your face, it's the only one I want to see every morning and every night for the rest of my life." Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks, warm and unexpected. "I'm not beautiful. You're wrong." His voice was fierce now, certain. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Not despite who you are, but because of it. Your strength, your loyalty, your courage, your kindness. I see all of it in your face. Every day, I look at you and think I'm the luckiest man alive." She kissed him then, there under the vast Montana sky, and felt herself finally, truly seen. Not as too plain or not enough, but as exactly who she was, capable and strong and worthy of love that saw past surfaces to the truth beneath. They married that fall, a simple ceremony with just the ranch hands as witnesses. Margaret wore a simple dress and no veil, her hair braided practically down her back. James looked at her as if she were wearing silk and diamonds, and she finally understood what he'd tried to tell her all along. Beauty wasn't about delicate features or fashionable appearance. It was about being fully, authentically yourself and finding someone who cherished exactly that. Years later, when people asked James Thornton why he'd married such a plain woman, he would smile and shake his head. "Plain," he'd say. "I've never seen anything plain about her. She's the most beautiful woman I've ever known." And Margaret, standing beside him with work-roughened hands and sun-bronzed face, would smile too. Because she'd finally learned to see herself through his eyes, not as too anything, but as exactly enough. As everything. As beautiful.